Okay, let's dive in. It's so nice to be with you all once again. My name is John McKnight. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the Dean of Institutional Equity and Inclusion here at Connecticut College, and we are in one of our final events for the Elevate Conference. I don't know about you all, but I have been completely invigorated by this conference. Of course, that's easy for me to say as one of the organizers, but I hope that all of you who've been joining us over the last couple of days have also had a great experience. I'd like to begin, as I have with all of the plenary sessions, by acknowledging the land on which Connecticut College sits. This land was originally inhabited by the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, and Eastern Pequot tribal nations. And those nations still live and thrive among us as neighbors and friends. And so we honor the historical period of settler colonialism through which their ancestors suffered. And we express gratitude and appreciation that you remain among us as neighbors. So with that said, this final opportunity to gather before we have our film screening tonight is really a chance to start to tie together some of the themes that we've heard throughout the last couple of days. I had a chance to speak with our final speaker earlier, or actually last week, as we were sort of discussing this session and talking about how vitally important it is for us to connect all of the distinct and disparate issues of concern that we know we're grappling with as a nation, as a world. And so when we started this conference, we talked about the Big Nine. We talked about all of those different social identities we carry and how the unique intersections of those are what we wanted to focus on in this conference. And so it seemed fitting to bring back someone who's visited our campus before to be able to discuss the work that he contributes to this really united sort of drive and push and movement towards social justice. So before we do that, this is the last chance I'll have to address the sort of large audience. So I want to just express my deepest gratitude to the Connecticut College community. This has been beyond our wildest imagination in terms of the number of people who showed up and participated in these conversations the last few days, the level of engagement. The wonderful, thoughtful questions and conversations that were happening both in the big sessions and in the smaller ones. And so I really just want to express my heartfelt gratitude to this community. In particular, I'd like to thank my own team, the DIEI staff, the professional staff, and the student staff, all of whom worked very diligently over the winter break period, no less, during a time when we're all supposed to be recharging to put this together. It's the first annual conference, so we're going to probably learn and grow and do things differently in the future, and we're going to ask for your input, the Connecticut College community as well as the New London community, as to what we can do to improve the experience for years to come. In fact, if you have suggestions already about speakers or topics that you'd like us to address in future years, it's never too soon to start sharing that information with us. So in a moment, I'll drop into the chat, but please feel free to email us at diei@concal.edu with any ideas or suggestions you have about future conferences. So again, thank you to the DIEI team. Your hard work has really paid off, and I think our community has benefited tremendously from all the work that you have done. Finally, I'd like to turn it over to introduce our speaker to one of our dynamic student leaders on campus, Elizabeth Wales. Both Elizabeth and Jonathan are calling in from California today, so they're not dealing with the snow that we have in New London right now. Elizabeth is a junior and a dance and government major. She is the founder of the Connecticut College of the chapter of Eye to Eye, which she'll tell you more about, inspired in part by the work that Jonathan has been doing. So with no further ado, I will welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you. All right, so our final speaker today is Jonathan Mooney. Jonathan is a writer, speaker, and activist who is a leader in the global movement to better understand learning differences and the ways in which our schools and our society can better embrace neurodiversity. Jonathan has dyslexia and ADHD, and he did not learn to read until he was 12 years old. He spent time out of the classroom and even out of school because he was being disciplined for being who he was. But through his perseverance and support from his mother and some exceptional teachers, Jonathan gained insight into his own learning style and went to graduate from Brown University with honors, majoring in English literature. While at Brown University, he and his friend founded Project Eye to Eye. Each week, they went to a local elementary school and shared their stories about being different learners, while also creating a space to connect with other students who learn differently. Eye to Eye is now a national program that has chapters at many colleges and high schools across the US, including Connecticut College. I am a student with ADHD, dyslexia, and executive functioning disorder. It is people like Jonathan, who I was lucky enough to hear speak during my first year at Con, who have motivated me and many others to become advocates for their own learning differences and for others. I was determined to start a chapter of Eye to Eye at Con College, and getting to hear Jonathan speak during my first year made me put this plan into action. There is now a strong community of motivated different learners at Connecticut College who mentor a group of middle schoolers each week through art projects, and if it wasn't for Jonathan Mooney, this would not be the case. Jonathan has helped people understand that his message is not just for those with learning differences and educators, but a need for our society to reimagine what a meaningful life is, what normal looks like, and how we define the worth of human beings. It is my great privilege to introduce Jonathan Mooney.
Well, hey, everybody. My name is Jonathan. I use him, his, he pronouns. I want to give a quick visual description of myself for those with visual differences who may be a part of our experience today. I'm in my mid-40s. I got hipster glasses on, and if my hair wasn't combed back, you would see that, as my 14-year-old son says every day to me, it's growing more gray by the minute. I am so honored to be a part of your community and conference today. Now, before I kind of get to my thing, I have just a few pieces of housekeeping, if you'll bear with me. First of all, I want to thank Elizabeth for that beautiful introduction. It meant so much to me to have you introduce me, of course, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your courage, for your advocacy, for your ability to share what makes you different with your community, and not just share your experience, but take your experience and turn it into action and activism on behalf of others. That is a true testament to your character, and it was such a deep honor and privilege to be introduced by you. Now, second piece of housekeeping. I'd like to give you all just a quick sense of how I'd like to spend our time together. I read recently that the average human attention span is about 15 minutes. And then I read that the average attention span of somebody on the last day of a 2-day conference on a Tuesday on Zoom is about 15 seconds. So I want to assure you all that I'm going to respect that research, keep my talking at you down to a manageable minimum, and make sure that we have ample time to talk together in the form of questions, conversation, and dialogue. So I want to empower you to put any questions, any comments, any thoughts that you have during my presentation into the chat, and then we will have a facilitated conversation at the end of my prepared remarks. Okay, third, and I know it's a lot, but final and most important piece of housekeeping. Hey, I want to give a big old shout out to everybody who made this gathering possible. I want to recognize the staff, the volunteers of the Division of Institutional Equity and Inclusion. Putting on a virtual conference is a big old pain in the ass. So I want you to find a way to thank them in whatever way. But more importantly, I want to thank them personally, and I want us to thank them as a community for hosting this convening. Good work is hard work. And I know many of y'all have been in the trenches of the upheaval in our nation over the last year. And I know at times it's hard to keep persevering and keep doing that important work. And it matters for us to come together in this virtual setting, for us to learn from each other, to listen and learn from our differences. And it matters that we have included in this conversation of equity and justice folks with atypical brains and bodies. And all of that is the doing of the people who organized this convening. So in whatever way you can, whoever you are, send John and his team a big old hand clapping emoji or some exploding fireworks. But this work matters, and I'm deeply honored to be a small part of it today. Okay, so with all that said and done, let me kind of get right to it. You know, I'm here this afternoon to talk about inclusion and social justice for folks with atypical brains and bodies, people who have historically been seen through a deficit and pathology lens, labeled abnormal and deficient. I'm here to reflect on that specific experience, but also to try to pull out and thread forward some of the insights of the disability rights and justice movement that has relevance to the broader social justice movements, can give us some new ways of thinking about where folks are disqualified, how in our institutions they are invalidated, and most importantly, what we, all of us, can do about it. And you know, this conversation of inclusion, empowerment, and justice for folks with atypical brains and bodies is deeply personal for me. You know, as you heard Elizabeth beautifully articulate, I was a young person who was disqualified and marginalized for my differences. You know, I was the proverbial square peg who did not fit the round hole of school. I was the kid that had such a hard time sitting still that I spent most of the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway. You know, I was the kid who had a hard time keeping his mouth shut. So I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist in the principal's office. And I was the kid, as Elizabeth mentioned, who struggled tremendously with reading. So I spent most of the day hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. As was mentioned, I did not learn to read until I was 12. I couldn't read until I was 12. Growing up, I'm sure you can imagine I had every label that could come to mind. I was called the bad kid. I was called the lazy kid. And eventually I became the special ed kid. I was diagnosed with a continuum of language-based learning disabilities, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and others in third grade. I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of executive functioning and attentional disorders, ADHD, and others in fifth grade. And I dropped out of school for about a year in sixth grade. That year when I left school, I struggled with a number of mental health challenges. I struggled with anxiety. I struggled with depression, and I had a plan for suicide. So you all can imagine, by the time I got into middle school and beyond, I faced all sorts of low expectations. You know, I heard it all, like many people who don't fit do. I was told I'd be a high school dropout by my father. I was told that I'd never hold a job by a counselor. And I was told that I would end up incarcerated by a teacher. And you know, I was asked here today to talk about how I beat those odds and transcended those low expectations. You know, opposed to being a high school dropout, as my dad thought, as you heard, I became a college graduate. You know, opposed to being unemployed, I ended up writing books. And most importantly, opposed to being an inmate, you know, I became an advocate, somebody who has dedicated his entire professional life to fighting for folks who learn and live differently. So I want to share with you what I have been advocating for. I want to share with you what I know we should advocate for together that will lead to inclusion, empowerment, and social justice for folks with atypical brains and bodies. And I also want to share how those core principles that I fight for can also lift everybody up and help us understand the mechanisms and the processes of exclusion so we can make sure we have a world that doesn't work just for some, but ultimately works for all. So when I think about those core principles that pertain to, are essential to the empowerment of people with different brains and bodies, but also help us build a more perfect and just union, there are three that I want to share with you now. I'll share these three with you for, about 25 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up and we will talk together. First and foremost, most importantly, the ground zero of empowerment for folks who learn and live differently is all about reframing and challenging who or what we call the problem. For most of human history, normal has been called good and right, and different, deficient, and bad. And that normal, as we all should know, is a social construct, a statistical artifice. The normal person is the white, affluent, able-bodied man. And that definition of normality has marginalized, has left so many people out, and has wounded those people differently. But it's also led to a cultural narrative, because we value normal over different, to giving the message to human beings who are different that they are deficient, to calling those people a problem. And that particular way of relating to other human beings leads us down a dangerous path of trying to make the square peg fit the round hole. So it is imperative that we challenge that problem in the person model. And we understand, for folks with different brains and bodies, that the problem isn't in them, but the problem is in the environment around them. Let me use my life experience as a way to illuminate that paradigm shift of what we problematize as individuals or as a culture. Let's take this thing that folks called my problem, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? Those words say explicitly that the problem is inside of me. But the reality is, this thing that everyone called a inherent deficit or disorder in my life, a problem inside of me, what was really a difference in the truest sense of the word. Now, it's a difference with very real and very neurobiologically based strengths and gifts and talents, and also very real weaknesses. I'm not naive about the weaknesses that come with having my brain. You all know that I still to this day struggle with paying attention. I have the attention span of a gnat. I struggle with organization and executive functioning. I have explored the feasibility of stapling my car keys to my forehead. Okay, I got that. Those are very real limitations. But what goes hand in hand with those very real limitations are a whole bunch of good things that we don't talk enough about. They all know that folks with atypical attention spans are often better problem solvers than the general population. Came across a research study recently that showed that EMTs, emergency medical professionals, firemen and women with ADD are better at their job than so-called normal EMTs. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, your house is on fire. You want that dude to have ADD, right? Forget paying attention. Come get my cat, So it is a difference. Good things, bad things. It is not my problem. My problem wasn't ADD. My problem was being made to feel lazy and bad because of my difference. The problem was the environment, the school desk. How in God's name could a school desk be a kid's problem? Well, let me immerse you into my relationship with the school desk, and it is a fraught relationship. For some folks, the school desk is not a big deal. It is a benign piece of school furniture. For me, the school desk might as well be a form of enhanced interrogation that would make Dick Cheney proud, right? This is my experience at the school desk. First grade, 12th grade, Brown University, doesn't matter. I see that desk, I see that chair, and before I even sit in it, my hands start to sweat. My face gets all red because I know after 5 seconds at the desk, my foot's going to start bouncing. 10 seconds at the desk, both feet start bouncing. 15 seconds at the desk, oh, I'm going to bust out the drums. 15 minutes at the desk, oh, it's all over. I'm the kid trying to take his leg and put it behind his neck, right? And that young person is shamed because we have a set of institutional norms that defines the good kid as the compliant kid. And if you're not the kid that sits still and raises their hand and keeps your mouth shut, well, guess what? Something's wrong with you. I got that message at home. You know, I grew up in an old school Irish Catholic household. So every night at the dinner table with my dad, it was, Jonathan, stop it, stop it, stop it. What is wrong with you? And I got the same message in many of my classrooms. Not all of my classrooms, don't get me wrong, but many of them. I'll never forget, I had a teacher in second grade named Mrs. C. I've had many, many gifted, brilliant teachers in my life who I will celebrate with you today. Mrs. C is not one of those, okay? My foot would be bouncing. She would stop class. She would point at me. All the kids would look at me, and she would say at the top of her lungs, Jonathan, what is your problem? We put the problem in the person. But the reality is the problem wasn't me. Problem wasn't ADD. The problem's not you. The problem is in a set of institutional practices that privileges some brains over others. The problem is in the passive learning environment where on average children spend 75% of the day sitting still. The problem is in the conflation or confusion of being good morally with being compliant, which has a long and nefarious history in our education system and beyond. And lastly, the problem is the social shame and stigma that comes from being called the problem. That's really the problem. Let me give you one of the best examples of the social stigma and shame that happens to the square peg that can't fit the round hole that I've encountered in my travels. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to young folks. It's probably the best thing I do with my time on this earth. And back in the day, I gave a talk in Green Bay, Wisconsin to third graders. And I walked in to give this presentation. And when I entered the classroom from the front of the room, I could see in the back of the room a set of boxes made out of bookshelves about 3 feet tall. So they took these bookshelves, made a box about this big. And in one of the boxes, I could see a head bouncing up and down. It was one of the third graders in the box jumping. Now, that's not a sight you see every day, right? So I turned to the teacher, and with all due respect, I said, hey, man, what's up with the box? You know, what's going on? And the guy looked at me with a straight face, not a hint of irony nor sarcasm. And he said, Jonathan, that's Jack. I said, you have a Jack in the box? Are you kidding me? They had put poor little Jack in the back of the room in a box. Hey, I don't got to belabor this point. You know, ADD ain't Jack's problem. The box is Jack's problem. The way difference is treated and turned into deficiency. That's the problem. And you know, the same is true with my so-called learning disabilities, right? You know, a lot of folks come to my store and they say, hey, man, you overcame your dyslexia, right? And that word implies that dyslexia is inherently a bad thing that one should overcome, that there's a problem in my brain. But again, just like ADD or attentional differences, this thing folks called an inherent problem in me was really a difference in the truest sense of the word. Now, it's a difference with very real neurobiologically based limitations. I want to be clear about that. I struggle with reading to this day. I read in the 12th percentile. I spell at a third grade level. I confuse words that look alike. Who and how, horse and house, those look the same to me, right? I swear to you, when I went to Brown University, I thought the university offered a course in orgasmic chemistry, okay? Now imagine my disappointment on the first day of that class, you know? So I got that. Those are very real challenges, but what goes hand in hand are some very real good things. Do y'all know that almost half, hang out with this for a second, Almost half of small businesses in America were founded by or are currently run by folks with language-based learning disabilities. So again, the problem's not in the person. I did not overcome dyslexia, as people like to say. If I overcame anything, it was dysteachia. That's what I overcame. I overcame being made to feel stupid. That's what really held me back. You know, we as a country, and subsequently as educational systems and frankly places of work, have a very narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence. And that narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence confuses or conflates being smart with a narrow band of academic skills. But I don't know about you. In my life, some of the smartest people I've ever met, they didn't read well, they didn't write well, they didn't do school well, but guess what? They could rebuild the car engine from scratch. And that person is just as intelligent and just as valuable as that person with a PhD. So we have to challenge that narrow definition of intelligence because it's been institutionalized and it's been weaponized as a way to tell whole swaths of human beings that they are less than. And it wounds them deeply because that narrow definition of intelligence turns into the smart group and the stupid group. Don't know if y'all remember the smart or stupid group in your education at all. I'm sure many of you probably remember reading groups, right? Let me ask you a question about those reading groups. Was it ever hard to tell which reading group was the smart group and which one was the dumb group? It wasn't hard to tell. You know, you got the blackbirds over here, you got the bluebirds over here, and then over in the annexed trailer building, you got the sparrows, you know? Come on now. We ain't fooling anybody. Let me put it this way. When I was growing up, everybody knew that my group was the dumb group because my group was a bird that did not fly, okay? It was an ostrich and it ran quickly, you know? And I spent all day long chilling out with C-Spot Run. And we all knew that the condors were the smart group because the condors were reading War and Peace. We all know what gets you in the smart group. And it ain't your tactile kinesthetic intelligence. It ain't your social emotional intelligence. It ain't your ability to talk, draw, build, connect with other human beings. It's a narrow band of academic skills that we have arbitrarily labeled as intelligent. And we all know from statistical research who ends up in the stupid group. And it's Black and brown young folks. It's young folks with atypical brains and bodies who are demoralized, demeaned, marginalized, and frankly, wounded deeply by that narrow definition of what constitutes the good, smart human being. And that's the problem, not folks who learn differently. So the problem was never in me. The problem is in a set of institutional practices that values normalcy and gives the message to people that different is deficiency. And that's true for folks with learning and attentional differences. But you know what? It's true for a continuum of people with different brains and bodies. You know, it's not the autism. If you listen to the lived experience of folks on the continuum, it's the bullying that's the problem. It's not the cerebral palsy. It's the inaccessibility. It's not the difference, but the way the difference is treated. And it's not the difference, but institutionalized ableism. That's the problem. And recognizing that as the problem, naming that as the problem, is a moment of healing and transformation for folks who have been called the problem their whole life. It's important that we dedicate ourselves to that healing, to give people the message that different isn't deficient and they weren't broken or wrong. But perhaps most importantly, When we reframe the problem, when we think differently about folks who learn and live differently, it leads us to acting differently. And that leads me to the second thing that I wanted to share with you today, that I know leads to social justice and inclusion for people with different brains and bodies. And that second idea flows logically and naturally from reframing the problem. And it's embodied in my life by my mom. So I want to tell y'all a little bit about my mom, because I as Elizabeth mentioned, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her, So let me give you a mental image of my mom, because a lot of folks dismissed my mom. They dismissed her in her own journey as a human being. I'll tell you why in a minute. And they dismissed her when she became involved in my journey as a human being. My mom was dismissed for a lot of different reasons. On one hand, my mom was looked down upon because she wasn't a tall woman. On a good day, in high heels, on her tippy toes. My mom is 4'11", little Irish bulldog, right? So people literally look down on her. My mom was also looked down on because of her socioeconomic background. Her parents, my grandparents, Irish immigrants, right off the boat, working coal mines in Montana. And then they moved to San Francisco, where they cleaned rich people's homes. That's what they did. And that's where my mom grew up. And, my mom struggled in school much like I did. But she wasn't recognized as somebody with differences, but called somebody with deficiencies. So my mom barely graduated from high school. My mom found herself a single mom. She had my brother and my two sisters, all while she was a teenager. And she found herself for a while on public assistance. So people looked down on her for that. And lastly, people look down on my mom because she has this very funny, very high-pitched, squeaky voice like Minnie Mouse. My mom totally sounds like Minnie Mouse, right? So people dismissed her, She wasn't tall. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't educated. She sounded like a cartoon character. But people dismissed my mom at their own peril because my mother, she cursed like a truck driver, So I'll ask you a question. If you were a principal or a teacher, did you want cursing Minnie Mouse in your face? And the answer to that question, if you are at all confused, is no, okay? But guess where my mom was every single day when things were going wrong for her son? Oh, she was in that office. How did we know she was in that office? Because every dog in the neighborhood was running away. Only bats could hear her high-pitched obscenities. Glass was shattering. My mom understood something. My mom understood that I didn't need somebody in my life to fix me. I needed somebody in my life to fight for and with me. And that made all of the difference. That fix-it mentality comes right from the problem in the person. It emerges directly from the cultural narrative that difference is bad and deficient and normal is good and right. We have spent so much of human history trying to make the square peg fit the round hole. We've tried to correct the physical and cognitive differences of people with atypical brains and bodies. We've tried to correct folks with atypical sexuality. We've tried to correct folks for talking the wrong way, coming from the wrong part of town. We've tried to correct or eliminate difference historically. And my mom rejected that because that was a part of my life. Let's organize things to make the square peg fit the hole. Let's remediate Jonathan's reading problems, spelling problems, speech problems. But the thing is, if you are fixed too much, if you try to make the peg fit the hole too long and too hard, eventually you break. And my mom rejected that fix the person model. My mom advocated for something different. My mom would say to anyone who would listen, she would say, if my son doesn't learn the way he's taught, well, guess what? Teach the way he learns. Now, I'll admit that was a paraphrase because when my mom said it, there were a whole bunch of F-bombs in there that I left out. But nonetheless, that's the role she played in my life. It's not the person that should change, but the context around the person. Systems, not person, change. And that's our work together. That's your work if you are a mom or dad or an educator, to be an advocate for changing the environment, not the person. And it's a fundamental change in your own journey if you are like me or Elizabeth, to not fix yourself, but celebrate yourself and advocate for your right to learn differently. And it's our work together to not fix the person, but advocate to social and environmental change to include and empower people with atypical brains and bodies who have been left behind. So as we embark on that work of not making the peg fit the hole, what should we be fighting for? Well, first, we need to fight for an equitable funding of services for folks who have been left behind. You know, educational inequity is a scar around our country. We have to invest in neighborhoods, children, and families left behind. Do you know that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the piece of federal funding designed to make sure that schools can't exclude people with physical and cognitive differences like they did historically, has never been fully funded by any presidential administration since it passed, Republican or Democrat? That is wrong. So let's advocate that fair doesn't mean equal, that folks need resources to be empowered, and let's fight for that. Let's also fight for the idea of accommodations for people with different brains and bodies. Accommodation is a pretty bold idea. It's the idea that it's not the person that should change, but the environment, that we have a legal and moral obligation to build literal and metaphoric ramps that create access to community, access to education, access to work. Those literal, in many cases, and metaphoric ramps for access makes a difference in people's lives. I know I'm here today because of accommodations that created access to education for me. I'm here because of the accommodation of text to speech, right? Told you all I didn't read all that well. And if you struggle with reading, you are denied access to knowledge and information. But in my life, I had people, educators, my mom, who created access through books on tape. That's what it was back in my day, right? Thing was so big, you had to put it into a backpack and plug it into a generator, right? That mattered to me. That was everything to me. I'm here because of folks who created access for me to express what I knew through speech to text technology. You know, when I was a kid, I couldn't write at all, and I couldn't spell. So I would only write things in class with the words that I could find on posters in the classroom. And if I couldn't find words to make a paragraph on the DARE poster in the back of the room, I would scribble and write monosyllabic sentences. So then everyone thought I was dumb, then I thought I was dumb, and the cycle perpetuated itself. And then I had teachers who said, no, Jonathan, why don't you dictate your ideas opposed to write them, creating an opportunity for me to show what I know. Those accommodations matter to people. Be an advocate for those in your life, in the life of your children, in the life of your students, but ultimately advocate for those accommodations for every single person who learns differently. But you know what? We got to go beyond services. We got to go beyond accommodations. And we all have to be advocates, not just for disability rights, but for disability justice. You know, we don't talk enough about that in this country. Do y'all know that folks with atypical brains and bodies get the short end of the stick? Do you know that over 80%, according to the Ruderman Foundation, of homicides perpetuated by police officers are obviously perpetuated on Black men, but also 80% of those homicides were Black men with a neurodiversity or a cognitive difference? Do you know that folks with atypical brains and bodies drop out of school at some of the highest rates out of any minority community in the country, are incarcerated at some of the greatest rates out of any group in this country, and have some of the lowest employment outcomes out of any group in this country? That is not a tragedy. That is a crime. And we need to be elevating that conversation, including that conversation in our moral arc of inclusion and justice. And we need to be expanding the circle to bring those folks in and to fight for their rights and justice for them as well. And that's our work. You know, don't make the square peg fit the round hole. Become an advocate to change the context, to include and empower and create opportunity for people who have been left behind. Okay, I got one more, right? I told you there were 3 things I wanted to share with you that I've fought for my entire life. 1, redefine the problem. Normal isn't right and good. Different isn't deficient. Don't change the person, but change the context. Be an advocate for services, accommodations, and justice. And last but not least, we together have to challenge the deficit model that surrounds folks who deviate from the mythical middle of normal. You know, if you're a kid like me, if you're a kid who doesn't look like me, but you struggle in school, you hear a lot about what's wrong with you. You know, I heard it all day long. You know, Jonathan can't sit still. Jonathan can't write. Jonathan can't read. Jonathan can't. But what about what I can do? That deficit model, again, applied specifically to folks with atypical brains and bodies, but applied universally to people who don't fit our myth of normal, is demoralizing and devastating. And it is rampant in our systems. You know, when I was growing up, I had something called an IEP. Don't know if y'all know it. It's called an Individualized Education Plan. And you should know that there is a overrepresentation of Black and brown young folks with IEPs and 504s. And it is a deficit document. Got to be honest about that thing. NSA, KGB got nothing on the IEP, right? That is a deficit-oriented document that sets in motion a set of deficit-oriented processes and procedures. A good friend of mine, former Secretary of Special Education at the U.S. Department of Education under President Obama, a gentleman named Thomas Ayer, who is now a professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. He researches the files that are applied to those kids, the IEPs, the 504 plans, the response to intervention plans. And his research shows that for every one strength mentioned in those files, there are upwards of 25 weaknesses. Imagine that being your life, you know. Imagine never hearing about what you can do and only what you can't do. It is demoralizing and it is wrong and it must be challenged. I know the power in my own life and journey of challenging that deficit orientation. You know, I had a teacher in 3rd grade named Mr. R. It's important that we celebrate the people who made a difference for us. And Mr. R is one of those for me. And he was a man that had a ferocious commitment to finding the good in every single student, every kid, every day. And he would ask every kid every day, hey, what are you good at? You know, what do you like? What are you interested in? And he would ask me that question. And because I was in IEP land hearing all about what was wrong with me, my response to Mr. R would be, hey, man, I'm not good at anything, you know, I'm not. But the thing about Mr. R is he never gave up. And one day he came to me and he said, Jonathan, I've been watching you and you are wrong about yourself. You are so good at telling stories. Now, sometimes they're inappropriate stories you tell, but I don't care. You are so good at telling stories that you could be a writer. I was 9 years old. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. I looked at Mr. R. I said, Mr. R, a writer? Are you out of your goddamn mind? I can't spell, man. Mr. R looked right at me and he said, Jonathan, in my class, screw spelling. Screw spelling, man. Yeah, you should have seen me jump out of my body because for the first time in my life, somebody said, forget what you can't do and focus on what you can do. And that was a revelation in my sense of self. And it was a revolution in my education. And every single human being deserves that. Be that Mr. R in somebody's life. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a loved one. Maybe it's a student. Maybe it's a child. And maybe it's yourself. Be that person that finds the good, that focuses on not what is wrong, but what is right. Because if there's one thing I know about folks who thrive in life, they don't get good at everything. They get good at something. They have an interest that becomes a passion, which becomes a purpose, which becomes a pathway. And I know that so much talent and so much good is being wasted every day out in the hallway, chilling out with the janitor, leaving school feeling that they have nothing to contribute. And we need that talent more than ever to get out of this mess that we're in as a country. We need the talent of that kid who may not be able to read but can draw. We need the talent of that young person who struggles with writing but can talk. We need your talent more than ever, because thriving in life is not about fixing what's wrong with you. It's about scaling and building on what is right. Okay, I want to conclude, and in concluding, I want to come back to, what is threaded through my journey, what is threaded through justice for folks with atypical brains and bodies, but frankly is threaded through our collective effort to build a more inclusive and just world. And that requires us to challenge that myth of normal. It requires us to share courageously our differences, which in doing so deconstructs, challenges that myth that there's one way to be. I know that power of sharing one's different in my own journey. I went to Brown. I told you, I transferred there. I was never supposed to make it to Brown University, and I transferred from a college where I was on full soccer scholarship before. So when I got to Brown, I thought I had no place. Here I was. I had my high school education mom with me. She had a sweet perm from Supercuts. I was walking around Brown's campus being like, what the hell is all this LL Bean? Never seen that before in my life. And I felt that I was a fraud, that I had faked it, and I had no place at Brown. And I remember that feeling was so intense that I almost left on my first day on campus. And I remember when all that came to a head. It came to a head at transfer orientation. So there was a seemingly benign icebreaker for all the transfer students. And the icebreaker was we all went around the room. We shared where we transferred from and what we did the summer before. But hey, this is Brown. So the moment it starts, let the brag fest begin, Kid raises their hand and says, oh, I transferred from Harvard and I worked at the National Institute of Health. Oh, I transferred from Yale and I worked at Goldman Sachs. So I transferred from Princeton and I'm on a short list for a Nobel Prize, right? And here I am saying, I worked, waited tables before I went to Brown, and I'm the kid who didn't learn to read till he was 12. What am I doing here? And I remember pulling out my phone and texting my mom saying, hey, Mom, I can't stay here. I got to go. And then the next guy went. He had purple hair. He had bicycle chains around his wrists like they were bracelets. He said, my name is David Cole. I transferred from Landmark College, which is a 2-year college for people with attentional and learning disabilities. And I worked construction last summer. I'm like, that's my boy right there. That saved my life. Him having the courage to stop faking normal. And that's our work together. The word normal did not enter the English language until the 1860s. It emerged within a social context of industrialization and standardization when there was a social imperative to make us more the same, opposed to celebrate what makes us different. And it's been put to nefarious usages. It's been used to justify the marginalization of folks who are Black and brown, LGBTQ folks, women. It's been used to justify the marginalization of folks with atypical brains and bodies, and its time has come and it's got to go. The reality is the only normal people are people you don't know very well. Because the moment you get to know another human being, it is their eccentricities, their fallibility, their disabilities, their strengths, their gifts, their talents. It is their differences that constitute their humanity. So our work together, regardless of which lens or identity you come to this work, our work together is the fight for every single human being's right to be different. Our work together is the fight for social justice, not just for some, but for all. Okay. Thank you all so much for listening to me talk. The floor, so to speak, is now yours. I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful moderators. I do want to do one thing before we open up on the chat. I know you all have busy lives. I know this is a hard time. So if you need to move on in your day for whatever reason, it doesn't matter to me, and you can't stay for Q&A, but you have a question that you want to ask, I want to give you 2 ways to follow up with me, okay? Hopefully we can put this in the chat, but the 2 ways are this. 1, come say hello to me on the social media stuff. It's all the same handle on Insta, on Facebook, Twitter, etc. It's the Jonathan Mooney. The Jonathan Mooney. Say hello to me there. Then you can email me too. My personal email address is my name, Jonathan Mooney, all one word, at me.com, me.com. So if you need to move on, I understand. Please be in touch if you can. If you need to move on, I want to say one other thing. I'm celebrating my 20th year as an advocate for folks who live and learn differently. And in celebration of that milestone, but more importantly, in recognition of the work still to be done, I am donating my presentations to anybody who is on a shared mission like this. Talking to kids in a kindergarten classroom, talking to community groups, whatever it may be. So if that's interesting to you, drop me an email, drop me a line, and we'll make that happen. Okay, I know that was long-winded. Elizabeth, John, the floor is yours.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. As usual, incredibly inspiring, engaging information. We appreciate the generosity of you sharing so much of your personal story with us. We do have some questions that are starting to come in. Elizabeth and I will review them as they come. If you in the audience have a question, please use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat function. That'll make it easier for us to see them as they come in. I'm also going to make a quick plug to complete an evaluation, not only for this session, but any session you've attended throughout the Elevate conference. That really helps us as we move forward. Jonathan, we have some questions, but I want to start with one I have, which is coming directly from what you've talked about and given the moment we're in. You know, we're in a global pandemic right now, and that has transformed everything about our world, including how we learn. And in higher education, and also in K through 12 education, it's been very disruptive. And the question that you and I spoke a little bit about last week, I would love to get your insights. Has the pandemic helped to close, or has it widened the gaps that you see between, you know, neurodiverse learners and everyone else that you would, you know, have been describing as normal, quote unquote?
Yeah, look, John, you're so eloquent and you're so well-spoken. What comes to mind is it's just been a shit show for the last year. So I'm just gonna cut right to it, man. Look, I think at a high level, statistical level, the hard metrics around mental health for young folks, engagement gap, achievement gap, exposure to enrichment, the enrichment gap. I mean, all of those gaps in the last 10 months have become chasms. You know, they've become accelerated at a exponential rate. And it's important for us to name that. It's important for us to name the historically marginalized constituencies that are bearing the brunt of that. But it's also in the spirit of progressive universalism, which is something I subscribe to, and I'm happy to find that in some depth. It's important to understand that those gaps have widened even amongst young folks who or humans that historically may be considered privileged or affluent. So we had those before. They've been accelerated. Did they have to be accelerated? I don't know. I'll come back to that in a second. But even amongst that, the acceleration of historic, longstanding trends and inequities, I think there's been a few bright spots. I'm always a little reluctant to find bright spots in what is a global tragedy. But it is important for us as human beings to find some light, to follow the light. And it's important for us when we debrief this time, because this too shall pass, to be able to not just go back to the way things was. I think we do have an opportunity to be reflective about our practices, certainly in education. And I can tell you that if there have been bright spots for some, I wouldn't say all, of folks who resonate with neurodiversity, the ability to access information at their own time has mattered a lot. The asynchronous learning experience. So for me, when I was in college, hey, if the kid next to me sitting in my English literature class spent an hour on a book, I spent 10 hours. That's just how it was. That's what I needed to do. So for it to be asynchronous frees me up on that. I think the idea of being able to consume visual information, a lot of education has moved to videos, etc. I think that's good for a continuum of neurodiverse learners. So those are bright spots that I would want to thread back in, to our experience. I also think the shift to distance learning, for me at least, because too often in the institutions of education I've had experiences with over the last 10 months, really what they've been trying to do is take the old school and shove it down new school pipes. And that has shown the fallacy even more of the old school, and what we know works in distance environments is to focus on purpose and passion, to be relentlessly focused on relationships, and to not be focused so much on content. And I think those best practices should be brought forth and reintegrated into our approach to education across the educational continuum as lessons learned and ways to grow moving forward.
Perfect. Thank you. And, another important sort of global issue, but certainly really concentrated in the United States that we've seen is just the racial injustice. And you brought up really important statistics about the intersections, right? In neurodiversity and race, right? And Black men in particular, often being the ones struggling with either mental health concerns, so on and so forth. So we are doing some work here at the college with the City of New London, thinking about police reform and thinking about, how can we better support individuals and recognize their challenges. Do you think, Jonathan, based on your work, that there's enough training we can provide to police to be able to recognize neurodiversity and or mental health struggles? Or should we just be trying to sort of move resources away from policing into other support structures? And is that a binary? Is there some sort of combination that you would recommend? I know I'm throwing you the light questions first, right?
Yeah, it's good. Look, it's not an either or, it's an and both. To your first part of your question, absolutely, there is knowledge and best practices to be integrating and supporting law enforcement to recognize their inherent bias towards racial bias, and to be also recognizing their inherent ableist bias. And I'll give you just a good example of this. A number of the homicides perpetuated by police shootings, domestically and globally, and one in particular globally is coming to mind in Israel against a Palestinian young man who was autistic. And the physical characteristics of autism were interpreted as threats. And that misinterpretation what was the catalyst for ultimately a death. and we can recognize those. Now that's a place for us to start. It's important to start there. You know, sometimes it's hard when we think about social justice. We're like, well, is that a Band-Aid or not? Well, you know, if what we can do is put some Band-Aids on, let's do that. And let's walk and chew gum, and then let's swim upstream to work at structural forces. Otherwise, we end up not doing anything, right? It gets sort of paralysis to analysis. So that's a good place to start. But what we need to talk about ferociously, fearlessly together as a community, which intersects between every one of the identity categories that comes to the table, is the mental health crisis that we are at right now. Predating COVID, accelerated by the social isolation that people are experiencing. And it's not been talked enough about at a federal level. Where's our national mental health a war on depression, anxiety, and isolation? That's what we need. You know, we need more than ever a national effort to take mental health seriously. And that effort needs to start with the folks who have been left behind the most. And that's historically Black and brown, low-income communities, and folks with disabilities. And that's the big change. But we need to do both. We need to walk and chew gum. We need to stay focused on lives lost every day because of institutionalized racism and ableism. And we need to swim upstream and deal with some of the root causes of that in our mental health work. Now, I will tell you again, as we think about our mental health work, there's always this tension between the person and the environment, right? Like even in mental health frameworks, is therapy the answer, or is green space the answer? And I'll tell you, the research is clear that the social determinants of health and social determinants of mental health are the things that we should be investing in, and not necessarily treatment programs. Those are important, but they're not going to solve the problem. It's not about fixing the person. It's about changing the context. And the social determinants health framework is a framework dedicated to that.
Awesome. So there's a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to smush two questions together. But one person was kind of asking you if you have any advice for larger classroom settings in the K through 12 setting where you're dealing with 30 kids and it's hard to maybe give that individual attention. Kind of what advice you have for teachers and educators to make a classroom more accessible overall. And then going off of that, thinking maybe a bit more at the college perspective, do you have any advice for how staff can support students, especially those with LD that might be reluctant to seek support, not as like proud of my LD, which can take time to kind of develop?
Yeah, let me start with the last one first. You know, when I went, so you know, I was in multiple different forms of special education programs in elementary school and early middle school, ranging from resource room programs to sort of pull-out based programs, traditional special ed experiences. And I left school in 6th grade, and after a very serious plan for suicide and social bullying by others, and we moved to a different school district, a do-over. And I'll tell you, the moment I got to that new school, I was not going to be the sped kid. You know, like that ain't me, you know, because my difference is invisible. I have to declare it. And because I have a number of privileges, being a white male, that I could leverage, and I am cognizant of doing that. I was gonna pass as normal, you know. I didn't tell anybody, and I didn't tell people in high school, and I understand where that comes from. You know, there are many inflection points in our system that discourages and stigmatizes people who do come forth. But I can tell you, for me and anyone out there listening, that sort of LD and proud to be, that was the tipping point on my journey of transformation. I alluded to the fact that I started at a 4-year school playing soccer on scholarship and then went to Brown. What facilitated that was me becoming activated as an advocate in my own life. And that required me to be out. And I use that word on purpose, out, as somebody with a neurodiversity in the way that Dave Cole was later. So how do we help folks do that in higher education? Well, number one, it's important right off the bat to say to classrooms, hey, neurodiversity is a real thing. I believe, I'm speaking as a faculty member, I believe that there are as many ways to learn as there are human beings in this room. And I know it's going to be a challenge to meet those multiple needs. And I know some of you may have historically been made to feel ashamed of that. But my class is going to be different. And let me tell you, if I would have heard a faculty member say that when I was a freshman in college, that would have blown my mind. In fact, the reason I went on a journey of change is I had the chair of the English department at Loyola Marymount University in a presentation talk about his own learning disabilities. So there's real power in the context and frame that we set, that's where I would start. And that doesn't cost anybody any money. We can do that tomorrow for free. And it's important for us to identify the places where we can start that make big change. And that's one of them. Are there other things that we can do in higher education? Of course. But let's do those easy things first, because often those easy things make the biggest difference. Now, as it pertains to the question in K-12, look, I don't want to be sugarcoat the difficulty of the job that educators in America face. You all are underfunded. And the system is designed in some ways to underfund, and you all are pushing that rock up the hill, every day. So that's to say that we need to be advocates for fully funding education. Compared to every other industrialized nation, we do not invest in children nor families or communities. We invest in war. We invest in fossil fuels. We don't invest in children and humans, and that needs to change. Now, that's not to say there's not something for you to do on the day-to-day. So I don't want to say that it's a big thing that you got to change, but then you're stuck in the day-to-day. So here's some things that I think you can do. I talked about my experience at the school desk, right? I talked about passive learning. On average, the American elementary school student spends about 75% of the school day sitting still. The thing is that human beings don't learn passively, they learn actively. And so the more that you as an educator can find active learning experiences, facilitate a kid fidgeting. You can't see my hands right now, but I got the stress ball in my hands while I'm talking, like that matters. That stress ball costs 35 cents, facilitate body breaks, facilitate ways for people to experience active learning. But ultimately, I believe that the North Star for our education is to move away from sit and get learning to moving and doing learning, and to have as much applied and project-based, interest-based learning as possible, because that's when young folks are engaged authentically, and that's when they really thrive.
Thank you. That was so wonderful to hear. Made me happy to hear. I think maybe, okay. So another question is talking a little bit about how in learning differences, the keyword different, there can be times when learning differences can make, depending on the stigma and what learning difference you may have, can be associated with higher performing students. Then there's other learning differences that are far more challenged in the U.S. educational system. What do you think are some thoughts you have on that, and how our education system overall can not stigmatize certain learning differences over the others? Sorry, I didn't say that as well to the person that asked that question. I apologize.
No, it was very articulate. And the question for me is getting to a really important issue, which is, there's a tendency, and I'll be honest, I think I've been, in my 20 years, you make mistakes in 20 years, or you grow, complicit in the unintentional hierarchy of abilities and disabilities. Like the dyslexic, because they go and start small businesses is valuable, and that difference is good, but these are really disabilities. And I think that that's a challenge. We talked about but John talked eloquently about the multiple identities that have come to this table, this community, to work in unison. And that matters so much because of the historic fragmentation amongst social justice movements, pitted against each other. Well, that fragmentation in the disability rights and justice movement exists too. There isn't a sense of fellowship, a common cause often amongst the learning disability community and the autism community. I know when I wrote this book called The Short Bus, for this book, I drove around the United States in a short school bus, which is a special ed bus. And I told my story, and then I profiled people with different brains and bodies around the country who I met. I remember there were some in the learning disability community that said to me straight up, "Why would you talk to somebody with Down syndrome? What common cause do you have?" Because I profiled a wonderful woman named Katie Basford with Down syndrome, who told me a lot about being human and how to be a better human, frankly. So we got to get over that. We need to find value in human beings, full stop. Not because, not if, not when they achieve, not when they go to Brown, not when they, whatever. We need to commit ourselves to a notion of human dignity for every single student. And to go to that very specific question, how do we do that in school? Well, in school, that requires us to challenge our hierarchy of intelligence. Intelligence as a construct, IQ, but then academic intelligence, has a lot of answering to do to the historic marginalization of people. My mom was called dumb. Why? Because she grew up in a neighborhood in which not as many words were spoken, and she felt dumb and gave up. That's wrong. And so we have to commit ourselves to asking a different question about our fellow humans. Don't ask in school or beyond. Don't ask how smart is that person. The right question to ask is, how is that person smart? And that question needs to be at the center of everybody's educational journey. How are you smart? So that we can learn and celebrate the intelligence of folks like Katie Basford. We can understand it's different than mine, it's different from yours, but it's in that different that we are better and stronger as a community.
Well, Jonathan, that's a great note to end on, and we just want to thank you all again, attendees, for being here, and thank you, Jonathan, for spending this time with our community. There were quite a few questions we didn't get to answer. Thank you all for putting them in the chat, but we encourage you to be in touch with him. He's been generous enough to share his contact information. So everyone, it's been a pleasure. Please complete the survey that Hannah has put in the chat once again. Thank you all for your presence, not only in this session, but throughout the last couple of days. We have one final event remaining tonight, a film screening with an alumnus of Connecticut College called Virtually Free. His name is Andre Robert Lee, and we hope that you will join us tonight. That is a great connector to a conversation we're also having tomorrow, as I mentioned, on the topic of policing in the US and in New London. So we invite you to check out the website if you have questions about those things and want to register. Jonathan, thank you so much. We consider you to be a friend of Connecticut College. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, the honor, but more importantly, for the important work that we are doing as a community. I wish everyone well.
Take care, everyone.